Jodi opened her eyes and glanced at the alarm clock. It was 20 minutes past 6. She realised she could sleep for another hour and a half. Relieved, she closed her eyes. "Jodi!" To her great upset, she heard her stepmother's loud voice from behind the door. A second later, Farah entered the room with Molly in her arms. "She woke up again and came running to us," the woman said angrily, placing the little girl on the bed. "And your father and I have to sleep on our only day off." "But I have a shift at the hospital today," Jodi said. "I need to sleep too." The stepmother snorted. "You're young. You'll get plenty of sleep." She left the room, slamming the door shut. Jodi sighed and pulled her little sister close. "Shall we try to get some sleep, Molly?" she asked. The little girl nodded happily. "I was scared to sleep alone," Molly confessed. "I came to Mummy and Daddy. Mummy woke up and started swearing that I was keeping them awake." "Lie down," her big sister told her. "You're not scared with me, are you?" "No," Molly joyfully replied. She climbed under her sister's side and instantly fell asleep. Jodi, on the other hand, couldn't sleep. She lay awake for the rest of her sleep time, trying to count to 100 and imagining herself floating on a slow river or bobbing on a boat, but nothing helped. Careful not to disturb her sleeping sister, she took out her internal medicine book from the bedside table and continued reading. There was a lot to learn before Monday. Jodi worked as a duty nurse in the vascular surgery department. She got the job after her 3rd year of studies, as soon as she passed her exams and obtained her certificate. The head nurse, Susan, carefully examined Jodi. Jodi quickly adapted and learned the ropes. She wasn't a spoiled girl and was able to adjust to new circumstances. Jodi had lost her mother in a car crash when she was only 6 years old. After that, her father, Gregory, became withdrawn and spoke very little. From the age of 7, Jodi took care of herself. She learned to wash, cook and clean the house. Her father didn't pay much attention to her. He left for the factory early in the morning and returned late at night, eating whatever his daughter had prepared. Then he would sit on the sofa in front of the TV and fall asleep. Gregory didn't show much interest in Jodi's school life, what she had eaten that day, or whether she needed money for new tights, pens or notebooks. It was her grandmother who opened his eyes to this. Mary lived in another town and, despite her advanced age, still worked as a teacher, which made it difficult for her to visit her son and granddaughter often. She came for the Christmas holidays and was astonished by what she saw. The flat was being kept tidy, the floors were washed, the dust was wiped, and there was pasta on the stove, but it was clear that it was all done in a childish way. Grandmother was a wise woman. She hugged her granddaughter tightly, gave her the gifts she had brought and took her to her room. There, pretending to be interested in Jodi's room, she immediately noticed that all her granddaughter's clothes were old and worn out. The holes were diligently, though ineptly, patched, the ink in the pen was almost gone, and there were only fragments of pencils left. "Take a look at your presents for now," Mary said. "Open that big bag over there. There are sweets. Enjoy them. I'll bring you some tea." She returned from the kitchen with a tray carrying a large mug of tea with milk and some sandwiches. "Eat and read your books," Grandmother said affectionately. "Your father and I will talk in the kitchen." Jodi nodded. Mary, looking at her thin, pale face, almost cried. She held back her tears, smiled at her granddaughter, and went to the living room, where her only son was watching TV. "Gregory, shall we go and have tea?" she called out affectionately, but something clicked in Jodi's father's head, probably some childhood instincts. In his childhood, his mother could call him home affectionately from the courtyard and then scold him severely for some mischief that Gregory was sure she would never find out about. In the kitchen, Mary poured tea and sat down, looking at her son with the usual gaze from under her brow. "What's wrong, Mum?" he asked cautiously, hoping that the premonition had been deceived. "Gregory, do you even see what's been going on in your family since Sarah died?" He swallowed. It had been months, but he still didn't want to think about his wife's death. As long as he didn't talk about it, he could pretend that nothing had happened, as if Sarah had gone on some long business trip, and it was unknown when she would return. But his mother, as always, did not tolerate reticence. Strict and principled, she always pointed out to him what Gregory did not want to see. For this reason, he feared her, hated her, and loved her at the same time. "What's going on?" he asked, delaying the inevitable conversation. "Everything's fine with us." "All right." Mary spoke in a calm voice that contained a hint of steel. "That a 7-year-old girl cooks by herself, cleans the flat alone, goes to school and returns home unsupervised. Is that all right? Do you even give her money for food? For school lunches?" Sweat suddenly broke out on his forehead. "She hasn't asked for it once," he muttered quietly, like a delinquent schoolboy. "She must have taken it from her piggy bank." The events of the last few months flashed before his eyes. The first days after that, and the funeral itself, he remembered poorly. Only that it was the beginning of September. The weather was warm, and huge, beautiful yellow, wedge-shaped leaves were falling on the coffin with a black lid that was lowered into the grave. During those days, their flat was full of relatives: his mother, aunt and uncle, Sarah's older brother and sister, friends, and colleagues from work. He thinks he even talked to them about something. And then he and his daughter were alone. His life went on autopilot. He still went to the factory, and his daughter went to school. He didn't think about everyday moments, and now he suddenly realized that not once during all this time had he gone to the shop or given his daughter money himself. He didn't even ask her how she was doing or what they were doing at school. So she had been running the household like an adult all this time alone, without saying a word. And she also had a birthday at the end of September, which he had also forgotten about. Gregory lowered his head and covered it with his hands. Mary patted him on the shoulders and head. "I know," she said in a much softer tone, "that it's hard for you now. I too, after your father's death, took a long time to recover. At least you were an adult then, but Jodi is still a child. She needs you. There's no one else to take care of her but you, Gregory." He nodded without raising his head. The mother continued, "Time heals. These are trite words, but only those who have experienced grief can confirm that it is so. I can stay with you until the end of the New Year's holidays, and I'll do what I can. But I can't replace her mother, and neither can you. And don't make her grow up before her time. Don't burden her with taking care of you, as well as herself. It's too much for a little girl." At last the son raised his head and looked at his mother with eyes wet with tears. "What am I to do then?" Mary sighed. She stayed for the promised period. During this time, they bought all the necessary products and also bought Jodi new clothes, shoes and school supplies. "I don't want you to leave, Grandma," Jodi said sadly. "I don't either," she sighed. "But what can I do? I have to work." "Can't you take me with you?" the girl asked. "No, sweetheart. You are your father's daughter. You need to support each other now. Only together can you cope." Mary also had a long talk with her son. "I realize that it's too early to talk about it now," she said, hiding her eyes. "But think, perhaps after a while you'll meet a good woman, get married. If this happens, it will be easier for you, and Jodi will have a woman to look after her." Gregory only shook his head. "I don't need anybody but Sarah." After Mary's visit, their lives became better. It was as if Gregory had woken up. Of course, it was still hard for him, and he often felt longing and despair. At such moments he wanted to just sit on the sofa, turn on the TV, and mindlessly switch channels, trying to dive headlong into someone else's fictional life, and not think about his own. But every time he pulled himself together and reminded himself that he was not alone. He would never leave his daughter again. Gregory started preparing breakfast for his daughter. Every day he asked her about her well-being and if she needed anything for school. Regrettably, he realized that his daughter had been accustomed to managing without him. She completed her own homework, washed the dishes after meals, and even ironed her father's trousers. Jodi had grown up. Soon Gregory came to the realization that he could not provide his daughter with a proper female upbringing. He increasingly pondered his mother's words. When Jodi turned 10, Gregory met Farah, a friend of his colleague's wife. Farah had been divorced for 2 years and immediately caught Gregory's attention. She seemed interested in him as well, and within a month they began dating. Nervously, Gregory introduced Farah to Jodi, hoping they would get along. "You're such a beautiful girl," Farah said to her future stepdaughter, "bright as the sun." "Thank you," Jodi replied. "You are also beautiful, like the Snow Queen." "You make a good point," Farah said. She had delicate features, fair skin, platinum hair, and pale blue eyes. "I am confident we will become friends." At first, this was indeed the case. Jodi eagerly reached out to the beautiful and kind Farah. During the first few years, they lived harmoniously. Farah appreciated Jodi's calm and diligent nature. Jodi excelled in her studies, receiving praise during parent-teacher meetings, and assisted with household chores. However, everything changed when Gregory and Farah decided to have their own child. Both in their 30s, Farah had struggled to conceive for a long time. This caused Farah to become anxious and frequently snap at her husband and teenage stepdaughter. Molly was born when Farah was 35 and Gregory was 41. Gregory eagerly anticipated the arrival of this child and worked hard to support his wife. During conflicts between Farah and Jodi, he always sided with his wife. "You need to be patient, my sunshine," he would say to Jodi. "Don't argue with Farah. She is going through a tough time." And Jodi was patient. She did not tell her father what cruel and unjust words her stepmother sometimes said to her. However, she concluded that she needed to mature quickly and become independent and self-sufficient. During high school, Jodi searched for opportunities to earn money. She worked as a cleaner in a cafe, walked other people's dogs, and helped a few neighbours' kids with their lessons. The payment was not substantial, but it was better than nothing. So she earned money for her small expenses, and even bought herself some things for the new school year. "Well done, my daughter," her father praised her. Even her stepmother said something positive. "Thank you for realising how many expenses we have and trying to help." Though the words stung, Jodi nodded and attempted to smile. From a young age, Jodi dreamed of becoming a doctor. No one had ever asked Jodi how she felt about her mother's death, but she would often reflect on it. Her mother was on her way home from work when the bus skidded on the wet road due to the rain. The bus collided with a passing truck, and her mother was sitting in the part that took the brunt of the impact. 15 people were injured in the accident, 2 of whom died on the spot. Jodi's mother passed away during surgery. Each time she recalled this memory, she tried to understand why it happened. Did the ambulance arrive too late? Were there not enough doctors, resulting in delayed surgery? Or perhaps the level of medical care at their hospital was inadequate? If her mother had been at a more qualified clinic, would she still be alive? The day she entered medical school marked a joyous milestone in her life. However, this new chapter required her to leave her part-time job. For the first 2 years, she barely had a spare minute. Her time was consumed by learning the Latin names of anatomical structures and memorizing an extremely significant amount of medical information. The 3rd year of study merged into an endless series of courses: pharmacology, pathological anatomy, operative surgery, pathological physiology, and others. By this time, Jodi realised she needed to do something with her life. Unfortunately, the conflicts with her stepmother had not ceased after these 3 years, and there seemed to be no opportunity to change the situation. The upcoming year promised to be easier, so Jodi passed exams for the nursing certificate, secured a job, along with a room at the hospital dormitory. "Why do you want to live in the dormitory?" her father asked. Jodi glanced at her stepmother, who was rocking little Molly in her arms, but quickly looked away. "It's only a 10-minute walk to work," she smiled. "I'll save on fares." Gregory sighed but did not object any further. Since then, Jodi has rarely visited her childhood home or stayed overnight. As it turned out, it was for a good reason. A few minutes before the alarm clock went off, Jodi carefully switched it off to avoid waking her little stepsister. She slowly got out of bed, gathered her things and quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Her shift wasn't starting for a while, but she wanted to leave the house as soon as possible. When she arrived at the hospital, there was still an hour before work began. "Oh, Jodi!" her fellow shift worker Anna cheerfully greeted her. "What are you doing here so early?" "I woke up early," replied Jodi. "How are things on the ward?" Anna shrugged. "Everything seems quiet. No admissions. We've administered antibiotics and done IVs and dressings." Jodi nodded. "Is anyone in the ICU?" "Yes, one person. A very nice elderly woman, by the way. She had an emergency clot removed the day before yesterday. I'll need to change her bandages." "Okay," said Jodi. "Well, since I'm here anyway, I'll let you go home early." Anna smiled happily. "Thank you, Jodi." And murmuring some popular song, she walked towards the changing room. As for Jodi, she made her rounds, greeting the patients who were just finishing breakfast. Then Jodi went to the surgeon on duty. "Dr. Bachman, good morning." The young, ruddy-haired surgeon with glasses looked up from the medical history, which he had diligently pasted some papers into. "Good morning, Jodi. How are we doing?" "Everything's on track. Are you coming to watch the dressings?" He shook his head. "If everything looks good, go ahead and bandage it up. If it's bad, call me. You're a future doctor. I trust you completely." "Okay," Jodi replied. This time everything went smoothly, and Jodi never once had to call the surgeon on duty. After the dressings, she administered the IVs. Luckily, there were only 4 today. While the patients settled down, Jodi began cleaning the dressing room, then put away the racks, disassembled IV systems, and went to the ICU. There, the patient was cared for by nurses and orderlies from the ICU, but the dressings were performed by the medics of the assigned unit. Jodi approached the bed and saw a small, pale elderly woman. Her eyes were closed, and she breathed slowly and deeply. "Mrs. Hambley?" Jodi asked cautiously. The patient opened her eyes and looked at Jodi with a faint smile. "That's me. And what's your name?" "Jodi, I'm a nurse on your ward. How are you feeling?" "Fine." "I'm here to change your bandages," Jodi said. "Yes, of course." The elderly woman tried to lift the blanket, but her arms were too weak. Jodi gently pulled it away for her. "Get some rest," Jodi told her. "I will do everything by myself." Mrs. Hambley smiled weakly and watched carefully as Jodi deftly cut away the old bandage, examined the surgical site, treated it, dried it, and carefully applied a new bandage. "Well, that's it," Jodi said it cheerfully. "Get well." The patient sighed heavily, but immediately smiled. "Thanks, honey." Jodi was about to write a note about the dressing in the logbook when she heard the anesthesiologist's voice from behind her. "Hi, tell Dr. Bachman that Mrs. Hambley has to be taken to your department at 5 o'clock. "Is she all right?" asked Jodi excitedly. "If only," snorted the anesthesiologist. At that moment he was called, and Jodi couldn't find out what was wrong. As a future doctor, Jodi was interested in almost every case that passed through her. She couldn't leave the old woman she liked without attention, especially after the anesthesiologist's incomprehensible words. She went to the surgeon on duty for clarification. He was still sitting at his computer, filling out his patients' case histories. Jodi relayed the anesthesiologist's words, and then, instead of leaving, she hesitated on the threshold. "More questions about patients?" Dr. Bachman asked cheerfully. "Yeah," Jodi replied timidly, "if you have time." He glanced at his watch. "It's lunchtime. Let's have lunch and discuss your questions." Sitting at the canteen and eating his meal, the doctor asked, "Well, what did you want to know?" "It's about Mrs. Hambley," Jodi replied. "We're taking her to our department. I mean, supposedly she's fine, but when I asked the doctor in the ICU about it, he reacted strangely. Dr. Bachman sighed. Yes, Mrs. Hambly is a grave case. She is 75 years old. She was brought in an ambulance with a suspected thromboembolism. She was operated on, and part of the clot was removed. But not totally? Asked Jodi sadly. The doctor nodded. Tomorrow there will be a consultation with the chief physician to decide how she should be treated. With the chief doctor? Jodi asked in surprise. Yes, he's a vascular surgeon, didn't you know? She shook her head negatively. Okay, said the surgeon. If you don't have another question, let's go to work. The shift went on quietly. Mrs. Hambly was placed in a separate ward. She thanked the doctor and the nurse heartily. Jodi thought with excitement that tomorrow there would be a consilium that would decide the fate of this nice elderly woman. Before the end of the day, she visited the elderly woman several times, and although she looked weak and pale, she still had some willpower. Each time she greeted Jodi with a weak smile, and somehow subtly reminded the nurse of her grandmother Mary. In the morning, Jodi's shift was over, and she went to her lessons. She had a cycle in endocrinology. The department was in the same hospital, just a couple of floors down. As she was leaving the ward, she was almost knocked down by a bald man. He had shoe covers on, and a dressing gown was thrown over his shoulders. He was obviously on his way to see one of the patients. Instead of apologising, he looked at Jodi with small piggy eyes, scratched his unshaven chin, and went on his way. Jodi's good mood was immediately spoiled. Hi, said Alexis, her classmate and friend, greeting her cheerfully. Why are you so sad? Did your shift go badly? Alexis herself worked at the same hospital in the gastroenterology department. Jodi smiled. Hi, no, everything's quiet. No one's even been admitted. But there are some problems with an elderly woman who was hospitalised with a thromboembolism. Is she in intensive care? Alexis asked. That's the thing. No, she's been moved to the ward. Well, if she's been transferred, it's not that bad. And anyway, Jodi, stop worrying about everyone. The girl smiled sadly. She looks a little like my grandmother. The friend shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. All grandmothers look like each other. After class, Jodi went to her dormitory. She needed to sleep a little and then sit down to study. But on the way, she really wanted to eat, so she stopped at a small cafe. She ordered some soup and suddenly saw the unpleasant man who had almost knocked her down in the morning was sitting at the next table. There was a rack of clothes between them, and the backs of the chairs were high, but Jodi turned away to make sure he didn't see her. The man, indifferent to his surroundings, spoke softly on the phone. Jodi unintentionally overheard the entire conversation, although she didn't like eavesdropping on others. It's not like I'm asking you to do anything to her, the man exclaimed into his phone. Neither you nor I want any marks left behind. Is he talking about dry cleaning? Jodi wondered. The man sighed, seemingly astonished by the incompetence of his conversation partner. You yourself said her condition was difficult at the moment. Her heart is a bit weak. Just wait a bit. Don't proceed with that procedure. The person on the other end of the line must have objected, as the man impatiently drummed his fingers on the table. Well, think of something. I'm not the one to teach you. If you recall, I didn't refuse you then, and your case was obviously more complicated than mine. The arguments seemed to work as the bald man leaned back in his chair with relief. That's good. I knew we'd come to an agreement. Glenn, I'll see you tomorrow, he said, hanging up the phone. The man's order was just brought to him, and he began to eat hurriedly and greedily. Jodi was also served soup, but she couldn't bring herself to take a bite. She tried to convince herself that the overheard conversation could be about anything, but her intuition told her that the bald man was up to no good. What could she do, though? Even if she went to the police and recounted the conversation word for word, it was unlikely anyone would believe her or take any action. With a heavy heart, she went to the dormitory, laid down on her bed, and fell into a deep sleep. Jodi's next shift was scheduled for the day after tomorrow, but in the evening she received a call from the head nurse. "Jodi, can you please help me out?" she asked. "My daughter was urgently called on a business trip for 2 days, and there's no one to take care of my grandchildren. Would you mind filling in for me?" "Okay, Susan," Jodi replied. "Thank you, sweetie. You'll be a big help. I'll call and let them know we've made a change." That day they had a lecture that ended late, so there was no point in going back to the dormitory. Jodi went straight to work. "Oh, Jodi, you're early as always," the day shift nurses greeted her. A few hours later, Jodi was putting data into the patient's records when suddenly there was the sound of the door opening. She looked up and saw Dr. Bachman and Dr. Glenn Kaufman, the head doctor, entering the office. They didn't notice Jodi. "Dr. Kaufman, you're saying that we won't perform any more procedures at all?" Dr. Bachman asked in surprise. The chief doctor sighed wearily, turned to the young surgeon, and trustingly placed his hand on his shoulder. "I'm telling you, we've done everything we can. Taking any drastic measures against her is an unjustified risk. You saw it yourself, her heart is weak. Let's give her a few more maintenance drips today and discharge her tomorrow." Seeing doubts in Dr. Bachman's eyes, Dr. Kaufman added, "Don't worry so much. Mrs. Hambley has already lived her life. She's had enough. Not everyone can be saved, believe me. I'm an experienced doctor, and I've seen many cases like this. Discharge her." Dr. Bachman weakly nodded. The chief doctor smiled with satisfaction and encouragement, then left. Only now did the young surgeon notice Jodi. "Oh, Jodi, you're on duty again today." The girl weakly nodded. "Did you hear everything?" he asked sadly. "Yes." "That's how it is. Get ready. You're going to be a doctor, and you have to make many tough decisions." "I understand." Throughout her shift, Jodi couldn't shake off her thoughts about Mrs. Hambley. Something was not right. After dinner, she put the elderly woman on a drip, and she said to her, "Jodi, the doctor came to see me, cheered me up, and said they'll discharge me tomorrow." "Yes, that's true. How are you feeling?" the nurse asked. "Still weak," the patient admitted. "Breathing is difficult, as if something heavy has filled my chest from the inside. But it's all right, I'll manage." The girl bit her lip, nodded, and adjusted the compression stocking on Mrs. Hambley's leg. "Thank you, dear," the elderly woman said. "You've saved me here. When my son-in-law came, I told him the same thing. If not for the doctors and nurses, I wouldn't be here any more." She smiled warmly and continued, "We haven't talked in a long time, even though he's my only relative who's still alive, even if not my blood. My daughter died many years ago, and my husband too. Since then, I haven't seen my son-in-law, but when I fell ill, he immediately rushed over, worried." She smiled, and suddenly everything fell into place for Jodi. She lifted her head and saw that the IV drip had finished. She disconnected everything carefully. "Rest," she said, and left. While the girl attended to the other patients, her mind replayed everything she had seen and heard during these days. The bald man who nearly knocked her over at the entrance, the same man talking on the phone with someone named Dr. Kaufman at the cafe, convincing him not to do anything. The conversation between the chief physician and Dr. Bachman, and the order to discharge a critically ill patient. Jodi gathered her courage and went to Dr. Bachman again. He was, as usual, filling out medical histories. "What's the matter, Jodi?" he asked. "Dr. Bachman, can we talk about Mrs. Hambley?" Jodi asked quietly but decisively. "Why are you discharging her?" The doctor sighed. It was clear that he was not pleased with the situation either. "Because a more experienced and senior doctor said so, and not just senior, but the chief physician of the hospital. Orders from the superiors, you know, aren't up for discussion." "But you don't agree with it?" Jodi said, looking him straight in the eyes. "I don't know, Jodi," the doctor honestly replied. "I suggested trying to dissolve the clot, but the chief didn't support the idea." "Why?" Jodi asked. He says her heart won't withstand it, and she's already running out of time. It's better not to take risks. Jodi hurriedly walked to the table and opened Mrs. Hambley's medical history. But her test results are good. Look, this is from today. She showed the surgeon, and the electrocardiogram shows normal age-related changes. The echocardiogram is also nothing serious. Dr. Bachman pursed his lips. Jodi continued, and her blood clot isn't that old. We can still try to dissolve it. There's still a chance. What is her prognosis now? A couple of weeks, the doctor said dryly. If she's lucky, a month. Jodi looked at him in horror. She still has a chance, she pleaded. Dr. Bachman sighed. What are you suggesting? It's the chief doctor's order. She will be discharged tomorrow. We still have time until tomorrow morning, Jodi said, looking at Dr. Bachman decisively. We can perform the operation ourselves. Jodi, the surgeon exclaimed. That's not how it's done. Such procedures can only be done in the intensive care unit, under supervision. Emergency medical services sometimes perform them too, Jodi reminded him, and the conditions there are even worse than ours, and yet they manage. Dr. Bachman sighed. You're so stubborn. Emergency services only do it when there's no other option, and every second counts, and the outcome is not always favourable. We don't have any other option either, Jodi almost shouted. Didn't you think that she's not being discharged for no reason? The surgeon frowned. What do you mean? And Jodi told him everything she saw and heard. Dr. Bachman listened silently without interrupting. Yes, the bald, stubby, unpleasant man with small eyes, that's her son-in-law, he confirmed. And he knows the chief doctor. I was called to Dr. Kaufman's office yesterday to report on the condition of Mrs. Hambley. That man was sitting there too. I wonder how he knows the chief, Jodi said thoughtfully. The surgeon thought about it. Mrs. Hambley mentioned that her son-in-law holds some very high position in the traffic police or something similar. You know, people gossiped that Dr. Kaufman's son had an accident a few months ago. It seems like someone was even injured there, but he miraculously got rid of the punishment. Jodi was surprised. So you're thinking Dr. Kaufman made a deal with him, and now he has to pay back the debt? I wonder why the bald guy wants to get rid of the old lady. The doctor shrugged. Who knows? It could be about inheritance or personal reasons. These are just our speculations, Jodi. But you're right, we need to save the elderly lady. Prepare everything for the IV drip, and I'll go get the medication. 30 minutes later, the doctor returned. Together, they went to Mrs. Hambley's ward. Another drip, the elderly woman exclaimed cheerfully. I thought we were done for today. Dr. Bachman smiled warmly. I decided to pamper you once more before you get discharged, but this one will last all night. Seeing the patient's surprise, he added, It's good that they haven't removed the catheter yet. You can sleep. The drip won't bother you, and Jodi and I will quietly check on your progress. Thank you, my darlings, the old woman said affectionately, looking at both of them. Jodi would never forget that night. She and Dr. Bachman didn't sleep. They couldn't predict how the medication would affect her. Perhaps the blood clot was too old and nothing would happen, leaving Mrs. Hambley with only a few more weeks to live. They risked and essentially committed a crime for nothing. On the other hand, the medication could be too strong, causing bleeding that could also be fatal for the patient. But luck was on their side. By morning, the drip had finished, and Mrs. Hambley continued to sleep peacefully. Her breathing was steady and calm. Before her discharge, I'll take another X-ray to see if the medication worked, the surgeon said. And if it did? Jodi asked. How will you explain it to the head doctor or her son-in-law? The doctor smirked. I won't. I simply won't include it in her medical history. My classmate is on duty today. We'll take Mrs. Hambley to the machine, take a look, but we won't write anything down. Only you and I will know the results. Jodi gasped. so they will think we're discharging her in the same poor condition. Exactly, otherwise we'll face plenty of questions. During the day, while Jodi was in class, she received a message from Dr. Bachman. Everything is okay. She smiled happily and put her phone away. Although she tried to focus on her lesson, her thoughts kept drifting back to Mrs. Hambley. How would she feel after being discharged? Did she have anyone to take care of her? She had mentioned that besides her son-in-law, she had no one left. Jodi couldn't understand why she was so concerned about a stranger. Jodi, focus! Alexis nudged her gently. This topic will be on the exam. Jodi nodded and tried to concentrate on her studies. The following month, Jodi didn't have any shifts with Dr. Bachman. She didn't have the opportunity to find out the details of Mrs. Hambley's discharge. And then she became busy with her study and work, so she no longer had time to think about the old woman. Those few weeks that didn't fall on duty, Jodi had to stay with her younger sister. You still live in our house, stepmother said to her. There is a room here where your things are, so please help. Of course, Jodi didn't mind being with her younger sister. 4-year-old Molly had just entered that cute age when children are interested in the surrounding world. The days were warm, and the sisters spent most of their time outside. On this day, they were walking past a large supermarket. Shall we get something to eat and go to the park? Jodi asked her younger sister. Peach yogurt in a bun, Molly declared. Jodi smiled. All right. In the store, they stopped at the shelves with yogurt. Jodi let her sister choose for herself, and the little one, with her childish fickleness, started examining the shelves, trying to decide what would be the most delicious. Jodi, is that you, my sunshine? She suddenly heard a familiar voice behind her. The girl turned around. It was Mrs. Hambley. The old lady looked quite lively. I was watching. Is it you or not? The former patient said. But then I recognised you by your hair. It's definitely you. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Hambley. How are you feeling? Jodi asked. Just great. Remember, you and the doctor put the drip on me before discharge. Of course I remember, Jodi cautiously replied. Well, after that, I immediately felt better, as if that heaviness in my chest had gone. And then at home, Dr. Bachman instructed. I started moving more, walking. Now I feel wonderful. I'm very glad, Mrs. Hambley, Jodi said. Is she your daughter? The elderly woman asked, nodding towards Molly, who was still unable to decide on the yogurt. Younger sister, Jodi answered. I'm taking care of her today while our parents are resting. We decided to get something to eat and go to the park. Are you going to eat in the open air? The elderly woman exclaimed. Come to my place instead. It's nearby. Let's have some tea. Oh, no. It's inconvenient for me, Jodi said. Mrs. Hambley shook her head. Stop it. I have pies and soup at home. An old friend was supposed to come for a visit, but she fell ill. She sighed sadly, and Jodi suddenly thought that Mrs. Hambley must be very lonely if she invited a barely familiar nurse to her house. All right, Jodi said, but the cake is on me, she added quickly. No objections accepted. As you wish, Doctor, the elderly woman said with a smile. Mrs. Hambley lived in a 10-minute walk from the supermarket. Seeing her big, beautiful house, Jodi couldn't help but be amazed. Wow, the girl exclaimed. It's so huge. The elderly woman smiled as she inserted the key into the lock. My late husband held a high position, and he built this house. Nowadays this neighbourhood is almost in the centre, but back then we lived on the outskirts. Come in, girls. Inside the house it was quiet. Everything was clean, although it was evident that the wallpaper, furniture and chandeliers had been there for many years. Jodi felt like she had been transported back 40 years, but the house did not look outdated. On the contrary, it seemed as if they had travelled in a time machine to a new and beautiful house from a classic movie. You have a stunning house, Jodi said. Just like in the movies, Molly added, echoing her older sister's thoughts. Mrs. Hambley laughed. Thank you, girls. Let's have lunch and I'll show you around the house. She cooked amazingly. The sisters appreciated both the soup and the pies. After having lunch, Molly went to the living room to start examining the numerous figurines on the fireplace, with the hostess's permission. Jodi and her former patient sat with tea in a cosy armchair in front of a coffee table to talk peacefully and keep an eye on Molly. "Thank you, Jodi," Mrs. Hamberley suddenly said. "For what?" the girl asked, surprised. "I should be the one thanking you for inviting us and treating us so well." The elderly woman smiled. "I am old, sick and lonely, and I have had almost no friends or loved ones for many years. I spend almost all my time alone. While I was in the hospital, I talked to more people in a few days than in the past 10 years. "I'm very sorry," Jodi said. "There is no need to be sorry. Loneliness is almost an inevitable companion in old age. I'm used to living like this, but it's nice when people like you. Jodi, come into my life. You are a good and kind girl. I'm glad that you and your little sister spent these few hours with me." Jodi slightly bit her lower lip, something she always did when she was unsure, but then she said, "If you like, I can come to visit you sometimes." "That would be great." Mrs. Hamberley smiled. "Come by any time, alone or with your little sister. I will always be happy to see you." And so Jodi gained a new friend. Despite the half-century age difference, she and Mrs. Hamberley had plenty to talk about. It turned out that the old woman had led an interesting and eventful life, albeit with some tragic moments. "I was born after the war," she began to tell Jodi, "in a small village many thousands of kilometres from here. There were 7 of us in the family. I was the oldest, and all the others were my brothers." "It must have been nice to be the only girl in the family?" Jodi asked. The old woman smiled. "Actually, not really. Maybe if I had been the youngest, it would have been different. But since I was the oldest, all I did was help my mother, do laundry, cook, work in the garden, looking after my brothers. Maternity leave didn't exist in those days. My mother barely had time to recover from giving birth before she had to go back to work." "Wow," Jodi was only able to say. "How did you manage with all of that?" After that, her own childhood didn't seem as difficult for her as she sometimes thought. "I just don't know that things could be different," said Mrs. Hamberley. "Everyone lived like that back then. But I knew that I didn't want to live like that. My father decided everything for me, found me a groom from our village, and even made a list of dowries he would give me. A pig, a dozen chickens and a calf. The groom's parents were willing to give him a horse, a young cow, and a duck with a drake, so the marriage promised to be profitable." She sadly smiled as if remembering something. "But I absolutely didn't like the groom. He was like an ordinary village boy, healthy and hard-working, but there was always something repulsive about him to me, like how he constantly got into fights for no reason, mostly with those weaker than him. He could kick a dog that had the misfortune of being in his way. And, most importantly, how he looked at me as if I were his property, even though we never even talked. There was only an agreement between our parents." "What did you do?" Jodi asked. "I ran away," said Mrs. Hamberley. "It was 3 kilometres through the forest from our village to the train station. The train stopped there twice a week, exactly at midnight, going to the capital. The train only stopped for 2 minutes. And imagine, me, an 18-year-old, the night before, I hid a small bag in the shed. In the bag there was a bottle of milk, a loaf of bread, and a spare pair of warm socks. I waited until my parents went to bed and sneaked out of the house. And then I ran through the forest at night. It was scary. I was afraid of losing my way, afraid of running into a wolf or a bear, afraid of being late, or that my parents would catch up to me." "You were so brave." "No, oh no, my dear. I was trembling like a hare, but apparently fate was in my favour. I arrived at the station just as the train stopped. I gathered the last of my strength and made my way to the last carriage. It was a compartment carriage, and everyone was already asleep. I opened the first available compartment and it seemed like no one was there. I climbed onto the bunk, covered myself with a blanket, and immediately fell asleep. I woke up in the morning when someone gently touched my shoulder. I immediately remembered where I was and realised that the conductor had found me, and then they would either kick me off at the nearest station or, worse, hand me over to the police or my parents. Or both. But it turned out that it wasn't the conductor. A young guy, maybe a couple of years older than me, was looking at me with surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked me. "I'm going to the capital," I replied. "Oh, really? And why in my compartment?" I shrugged my shoulders. "Well, you're alone here anyway. Is a seat that precious to you?" "So, you don't have a ticket?" he asked. That's when I realised that he would report me, and I started to cry. But he seemed scared. "Why are you crying right away?" he said. "I'm not going to tell the conductor about you. I don't mind. And besides, I bought you some tea. Are you hungry?" I climbed down and took out my bag. I had bread and milk, and he had a lot of food that his parents packed for him. "So he didn't report you?" Jodi asked with a smile. Mrs. Hambley shook her head. "No, we got to know each other. We talked. It turned out that he was born and raised in a town that was a 2-hour train ride from my village, and now he studies in the capital. He was visiting his parents. I briefly told him about myself and said that I was going to apply to a theatre school." "Where are you going to live?" he asked. "In a dormitory." "And if you don't get accepted?" "I will get accepted." "You're an adventure girl, and you have too few things to move to the capital," said the guy. "I don't like to take unnecessary things with me," I told him. In the end, he gave me the address of his dormitory and said I could always turn to him if I needed help. "Were you really going to become an actress?" Jodi asked. "Oh, I went everywhere I could just to get a place to stay in the dormitory. But as I said, fate favoured me. In general, the director, who urgently needed a girl of typical appearance for his theatre, was an examiner in acting class. He saw me and said that I was what he needed. Don't look at me like this. I used to be beautiful at 18. Mrs. Hambley smiled and handed Jodi an old black and white photograph. It showed a smiling girl with huge eyes, long eyelashes, a slightly upturned nose, slightly plump lips, and a thick, light braid draped over her shoulder. "Yes, you are very beautiful," Jodi said, smiling as she examined the photograph. After my admission, I went to the cafeteria and asked the woman there if she needed an assistant. "I can wash all the dishes or floors for you. Just give me something to eat." She turned out to be a kind woman. She fed and let me stay with her until I was given a place in the dormitory, and so gradually life began to improve. "But how?" Jodi asked. "You were alone in a strange city, without money and belongings." The elderly woman smiled. "Oh, my dear, we could talk about that for a whole week. But do we need to? I won't say that it was easy for me. Maybe I managed because I was young, had a lot of energy, and had nowhere to retreat. I was even afraid to imagine what my parents would do to me if I went back. Well, and of course, the prospect of marriage was also scary. In the capital, although it was difficult, I always lived with hope for the future. And kind people helped. My roommates, who were also girls from the village or backwoods town, shared what they could, including food and clothing. Sometimes the teachers would give me some extra work. Of course, officially it was all forbidden, but people still wanted someone to sing or dance at a wedding or anniversary, so we lived." "Wait," Jodi said. "Did you meet that man traveller of yours from the train again?" Mrs. Hambley smiled cunningly and said, "Of course, but not right away. First I settled in the new place, got used to studying, and got to know the city a little. Then I borrowed a dress and shoes from my friend and went to visit. I caught some guy near his dormitory and asked him to tell Paul from room 20 that his stowaway travel companion was waiting for him." "Wow, did he come out?" "He came out in a minute. I still remember it. He said he couldn't believe that I would actually come. And what happened next?
He invited me in for tea. It turned out that he was studying at a very prestigious department, something between political science, sociology and management. If we put it in modern terms, Paul was so enthusiastic about all of this. He believed that he could help people. He had an amazingly bright mind and a good memory, and Paul could analyse information like no one else. He could easily explain the most complicated things to me. For 2 months we just talked, visited each other, went for walks, and then he asked me to be his girlfriend. Of course, I agreed. A month later, Paul gathered the courage and proposed to me. I agreed again.
What was your wedding like? Jodi asked.
The elderly woman smiled. I wore the most beautiful dress that I could find in the dormitory. We invited my friends and Paul's friends. We took photos near the registry office, and then we all had a party in the canteen. But the most important thing was, as newlyweds, we were located a separate room in the dormitory, and that's how our married life began. I won't dwell on it for too long because the first few years were difficult. It may sound pompous, but love helped me not to notice all of that. It also helped that we were both passionately in love with the work we were doing. I was willing to spend several days and nights at the theatre, and he had his meetings and business trips. We didn't see each other very frequently, but that only made our love stronger.
Mrs. Hambley suddenly fell silent. Jodi suddenly thought that she was probably tired of talking so much. Maybe next time you will tell me the rest, she gently offered. I have already tired you.
Mrs. Hambley laughed. It is me who tired you with my century-old stories.
No, not at all.
But you're right. Let me tell you the rest next time.
A couple of days later, Jodi's shift finally coincided with Dr. Bachman.
Oh, student, he greeted her happily as he entered the post.
Good day, Jodi smiled. How are you?
Fine as always. I want to sleep and eat.
Nothing new, Jodi smiled. Jodi cautiously looked into the corridor and, making sure no one was there, quietly asked the surgeon, Do you remember Mrs. Hambley?
I remember, the doctor immediately replied seriously.
What about her? Everything is fine. Jodi hurried to reassure him. I've just met her recently. She looks great and feels well.
Really?
He asked. Yes. He sighed with relief, closed his eyes and blissfully smiled. Then he opened his eyes and looked at Jodi.
So it was all worth it, right?
Jodi smiled in response. It was worth it.
The doctor nodded. It's all because of you. You did an impressive job saving the elderly lady.
Oh, come on, Dr. Bachman. Nothing would have worked without you.
All right, let's agree that we acted together,
but we shouldn't do it again.
Jodi smiled. If you happen to see Mrs. Hambley again, say hello. She's a lovely old lady.
Definitely. Jodi passed on the doctor's message during her next visit.
Oh, thank you so much, the elderly lady said joyfully. May God bless him with good health. He's so young and handsome. Clearly he works all the time, probably not married.
I don't know, Jodi replied, but it seems not.
Keep an eye on him, Mrs. Hambley slyly said. He's a good guy.
Jodi blushed. You promised to continue the story? She changed the subject.
Oh, right, the elderly lady replied. Where did we stop?
You were telling about how you and Paul lived in the dormitory, how you had worked a lot and didn't see each other often, Jodi reminded her.
Yes, I remember now. In short, after a few years, everything worked out for us. My husband's career was going up. He gradually built this house. When we moved here, we decided that we could think about having a child. A year later, our daughter Lauren was born. How happy we were.
Mrs. Hambley fell silent, and Jodi saw a small tear rolling down the old lady's wrinkled cheek. She quickly wiped it away with her sleeve and continued. I left the theatre for a couple of years. It turned out that being a mother is no less fascinating than being an actress. I constantly thought about how my husband and I could create something so beautiful. Lauren looked like a little porcelain doll. Huge blue eyes, white skin, black curly hair,
I dressed her up like a doll. We couldn't refuse her anything. And perhaps that's why Lauren grew up a bit spoiled. It was impossible not to grow up like that, when your parents called you a princess and considered you their personal deity. Unfortunately, we saw the consequences of our upbringing too late. Mrs. Hambley paused again. Would you like some water? Jodi offered. Yes, dear, please. A few minutes later, the elderly woman was ready to continue. Lauren's teenage years were difficult. It was a hard time of world economic crisis. They stopped paying me at the theatre. Paul, too, with his values and honesty, was not needed by anyone. In general, we were struggling as best we could at that time and didn't pay enough attention to Lauren. We didn't notice that she'd gotten involved with bad young people, disappeared somewhere at night, argued with us and didn't tell us anything about herself. My husband and I, we were losing our daughter, but no matter what we did, it only got worse. And then everything changed. Lauren came home and announced to us that she was getting married. She promised to introduce us to her fiancé soon. And it was Bill. Maybe you've seen him. Yes, Jodi said, without specifying under what circumstances she had seen him. Honestly, my husband and I were very surprised. It was strange that they could have something in common, but then Lauren explained how they met. She was speeding and Bill stopped her. Yeah, I still don't understand how Bill managed to win our daughter's heart so quickly. But they got married quickly. Several months passed after they met. We thought our daughter had finally come to her senses. She became a model wife and homemaker. But over time, we started to notice that Lauren didn't look happy at all. We started asking her what was wrong, but she always answered that everything was fine. And then one night, she left the house, got into her husband's car, and drove somewhere. It was raining that day, the road was slippery, and the car flipped over several times. Oh, Jodi said softly. She died on the spot. Paul and I couldn't believe it for a long time. We asked Bill what happened, and he said they had a fight. She ran out of the house and left. After that, my husband and I felt like our lives had lost meaning, and Paul never recovered from the death of our daughter. He passed away 5 years later. I'm sorry, Jodi said. The elderly woman nodded. In general, there's nothing else to add. Jodi gently took her hand, and Mrs. Hambley replied to this gesture. Thank you, dear. You're a very kind girl. Then Jodi decided to ask her what had been bothering her for a long time. Do you still communicate with your son-in-law? Mrs. Hambley shrugged. In the beginning, after Lauren's death, we communicated, but then less and less. Then he helped me with Paul's funeral. I remember I told him, Bill, you're now my only close person and heir. After that, he started calling and visiting me occasionally, but not often. Of course, I can't blame him for that. He has a high position. After this conversation, Jodi and Mrs. Hambley seemed to become like family to each other. The girl now regularly visited the elderly woman, brought groceries, and stayed overnight. While some aspects of her life and certain moments became clearer, others became even stranger. For example, Jodi became more convinced that Mrs. Hambley's son-in-law had specific motives for wishing harm to her, and Jodi feared for the old woman's life and health. However, her son-in-law never appeared in her presence. Perhaps he's biding his time, Jodi said to Dr. Bachman. She told him everything she had learned. They were on duty together again, and now they were having dinner. Well, it seems like you're going a bit overboard with fulfilling your medical duty, the doctor sighed. I can't abandon her, Jodi said. The surgeon sighed again. Yes, I've already understood that. But what are you going to do? If this son-in-law has even pressured the chief doctor, what can we do to counter him? I don't know, Jodi replied. I hope he at least won't intentionally harm her. I think he won't. Maybe we should somehow warn Mrs. Hambley about a possible attack? Jodi sighed. I've thought about it, but what evidence do we have? She has known her son-in-law for many years, while she has known me for only a few months. And what can she do? For example, not transfer her house to him, the doctor suggested. But what if it's not just about benefit? What if he simply hates her? And this story about Lauren's death also seems suspicious to me.
Do you think he sent his own wife to the other world?
I don't know, Jodi honestly admitted. It turns out that we lack evidence for accusations, even to convince Mrs. Hambly herself. Then an idea came to Jodi's mind. Maybe you could somehow visit her with me, talk to her. I think she might listen to you. The doctor raised his eyebrows. Why would she listen to me just because I'm a doctor? Yes, she always asks about you and speaks highly of you, Jodi said. Dr. Bachman smiled. It's nice that she values my medical skills so highly, but I doubt my authority in her eyes extends to other aspects of life. I don't think I can go to her house and say, your son-in-law wanted to send you to the other world. She'll respond, of course, Dr. Bachman, I totally believe you. Jodi felt embarrassed. I'm sorry. I'm just scared to think that I know Mrs. Hambly is in danger, that she narrowly escaped death, but perhaps she is still in danger. Dr. Bachman sighed. Jodi, are you trying to play on my conscience? In the end, they agreed that Jodi would visit Mrs. Hambly more often and keep an eye on her. 3 weeks passed after this conversation. Jodi was already approaching the dormitory when her phone rang. Yes, Dr. Bachman, she answered with some surprise. Are you far from the hospital? He asked. About 10 minutes away, why? Let's meet at the hospital cafe in about 15 minutes. It's very important. All right, Jodi replied. I'll be there. Great, and Jodi, please order mushroom soup with croutons and a beef à la française for me. I just finished my shift. Then Dr. Bachman approached just as the waitress was placing the plates of food. Hello, Jodi. The doctor greeted her without wasting time, started eating. The girl understood that he didn't intend to talk to her anytime soon. Shrugging, she also began to eat. I love this mushroom soup, Dr. Bachman said, leaning back against the high backrest with pleasure. The best in town. I'll definitely try it next time, Jodi said. But you didn't invite me here for the soup, did you? Maybe I missed you, the doctor smiled, seeing that the girl was looking at him seriously. Then he continued in an entirely different tone. It seems we have evidence now. What? Jodi leaned towards him. Tell me! The doctor sighed and looked around. At that moment there was no one else in the cafe besides them. Well, today the head of the department sent me to the chief physician. I had to deliver several medical documents for review. Usually the secretary sits with the chief, but I guess she was at lunch. I wanted to knock, but then I noticed that the door was ajar and heard familiar voices coming from inside. The first person, as you can guess, was our esteemed Dr. Kaufman, and the second, the doctor paused appropriately, Mrs. Hambly's son-in-law. And? Jodi's voice trembled with excitement. What happened next? And then I realized I should turn on the voice recorder on my phone, and I didn't regret it. What were they talking about? Well, if I were to summarize the gist, the son-in-law asked Dr. Kaufman why he told him that his mother-in-law only had a month left, but she's still lively and cheerful. The chief replied that you can't predict everything down to the minute and added, well, don't worry, your old lady will die any day now. The body's compensatory reserve is not infinite. Oh, my goodness. Yes, to that Mrs. Hambly's son-in-law replied that when he had been asked to cover up the consequences of Dr. Kaufman's son's accident, he organised everything properly and in a short time. And how did it end? Jodi asked. I don't know. I heard footsteps and barely had time to move away from the door. Did they notice you? No, the secretary returned from lunch. I pretended I had just come in. She said Dr. Kaufman was busy. I left the documents with her and left myself. Dr. Bachman, Jodi exclaimed, why are we sitting here? Let's go to Mrs. Hambly's place. Without giving the doctor a chance to react, she dialed Mrs. Hambly's number. She didn't mind Jodi's visit and was even more delighted to hear that she would be with the doctor. Oh, my dears, the elderly lady said excitedly. What a surprise you've arranged for me. Fortunately, there's something to have with tea. "Don't worry, we just ate," Dr. Bachman said. He clearly felt uncomfortable. "We're here on business," Jodi said. Mrs. Hambley raised her eyebrows. What happened? There was a slight pause. None of them dared to start. Finally, Dr. Bachman spoke up. "Mrs. Hambley, Jodi and I have some suspicions regarding your son-in-law." "Bill?" she asked, surprised. "Yes, let's sit down," he said. They all sat in the living room, and Dr. Bachman and Jodi cautiously and orderly recounted all the events they had witnessed. In the end, the doctor played the audio recording he had made outside the chief physician's office. Throughout the whole time, Jodi was afraid that their former patient would feel unwell. But surprisingly, the elderly woman remained quite spirited throughout the entire telling, not interrupting, and only pressing her lips together more tightly. "Yes, my dears," she said after all, "you surprised me. I thought you saved my life once, but it turns out you're like guardian angels, protecting me even outside the hospital." The doctor and nurse went silent, exchanging glances. "Perhaps you are surprised that I am reacting so calmly," the old woman continued, "but deep down I always suspected Bill. Even when Lauren first brought him to meet us, it was clear that there was something dark about him." "Mrs. Hambley," Jodi said cautiously, "now we need to come up with a way to keep you safe." Mrs. Hambley nodded. "I am safe, don't worry," she said, glancing at the clock. "We have 5 minutes left. Hide behind that door and turn on your cameras." "Why?" Jodi didn't understand. "My son-in-law will come to visit me in 5 minutes," Mrs. Hambley calmly explained. "Well, how are you feeling?" Bill asked cheerfully as he crossed the threshold. Mrs. Hambley sighed. "Oh, Bill, I don't even know what to say to you." He frowned. "Speak the truth." "To be honest, not very well," the woman replied. "I felt fine when I was discharged from the hospital, as if I hadn't been sick at all, but now it feels like some kind of relapse has occurred." Slowly, she walked to the kitchen and started making tea. Bill rushed to her and helped. "Bill, please put everything on the tray and take it to the living room," the old woman said. "The chairs there are more comfortable for me." Bill placed the cups, sugar bowl, milk jug, vases of candies and cookies on the tray and carried everything to the living room. Then he returned for Mrs. Hambley and helped her walk. With visible effort, she sat down in the chair and leaned back. "So, how is your health?" Bill asked again. "Oh, Bill, weakness comes over me, as you can see. I can barely walk, and I have trouble breathing, especially at night. Sometimes my heart beats so fast, as if it's about to jump out of my chest. But there is also a heaviness in my chest, and I feel it increasing every day." The son-in-law sympathetically took her hand. "Should I take you to the hospital tomorrow?" The elderly woman waved her hand. "What's the use when I was discharged? The doctors told me that they did everything they could. Even the chief doctor came to check." Bill vigorously nodded. "Yes, if the chief doctor said so." The woman sighed heavily again. "Well, I can feel it myself," she said. "I feel like death is lurking nearby." "Mrs. Hambley, don't say that." "Oh, come on, Bill, I've lived my life, and lately I've been thinking about Lauren more and more." Bill frowned. "What about Lauren?" "I keep thinking, how did we all lose her? Me, Paul and you. How did we not see that something was wrong with Lauren?" "No one's to blame. It was an accident," Bill replied. It was clear that talking about his deceased wife didn't bring him any pleasure, but the woman continued as if she didn't notice. "Bill, tell me now, what was it that caused you two to fight back then? That she ran away from home in the middle of the night, so that I can find peace before I die?" The son-in-law darkened. "I don't remember. It's been so many years. It was usually something trivial. You remember how headstrong she was?" "I remember, Bill. I remember everything." They were silent for a few seconds. "You know," the elderly woman said, "I always wondered why you've been bothering with me all these years. So many years have passed since Lauren's death, and you still call and visit me. Especially after I got sick. You started to worry." Bill frowned again. What are you implying? She shrugged. Is there something I can imply? He stood up and nervously wandered around the room, saying, Mrs. Hambley, are you in your right mind? I am visiting you out of kindness, you could say, out of pity. You have no one else but me. He almost shouted the last sentence. Well, I don't know any more, Bill, whether I've lost my mind or not. I've been living for the past few years without seeing or hearing much from you. But when I ended up in the hospital, you started visiting, and then suddenly the head doctor took an interest in me, a simple pensioner. Why all of a sudden? How should I know? Out of kindness, the son-in-law sarcastically replied through his teeth. Maybe, but here's a strange coincidence. This doctor has a son who recently had an accident, and everyone was convinced that he was to blame. It appears that he got behind the wheel while drunk. However, he faced no consequences for it. Bill was terrifying to look at. He was all red from the top of his bald head to his neck. The vein on his right temple pulsated fiercely. And then this head doctor says that he can no longer help me, the woman continued calmly, and he forces the doctor to discharge me the very next day. Enough, Bill shouted. Why are you still alive? Mrs. Hambley turned pale but said, Don't worry, I don't have much time left. Just tell me one thing before I go. Are you responsible for Lauren's death? No, it wasn't me, he exclaimed. She ran away from me because she couldn't bear living with me anymore, because she never loved me. On the contrary, she hated me more and more every day, but I loved her. Then why did she marry you? The elderly woman asked in astonishment. Because I saved her from prison. She was driving under the influence. I tried to stop her, but she hit me with the car. She immediately stopped and got out of the car, shaking me. She took me to the hospital. As soon as I saw her, I fell in love, and I said, Either you'll go to prison for a long time, or marry me. Mrs. Hambley pressed her palms to her mouth, holding back tears. My poor foolish girl, she whispered quietly. Bill seemed to no longer hear her. I did everything to make her happy. I was willing to climb over heads at work to rise higher. I bribed and blackmailed, all to have enough money for us. She didn't have to work. I gave her as much money as she wanted. For a while, it even seemed like everything was good between us. But then we started arguing constantly. That day, we argued until late at night. She shouted that she would rather have been in prison than married to me, and then she ran out onto the street, got in the car and drove away. Tears rolled down Mrs. Hambley's cheeks. My poor little foolish girl, she repeated. Thanks to you, I really needed a house, Bill continued. It's big, worth a lot, and located in the city centre. And you've already lived your life. If you don't intend to die, then I'll help you. That won't happen. Suddenly a male voice came from somewhere. Bill froze in place. A tall young man and a red-haired girl emerged from under a mound. Both of their faces seemed vaguely familiar to him. You won't harm anyone else, the girl said dryly. She had a phone in her hands, and she was clearly recording him. Who are you? Bill shouted. My saviours, Mrs. Hambley replied in a calm, firm voice. She straightened up and now looked entirely different from the dying old woman she appeared to be just a couple of minutes ago. All of you, Bill muttered, backing towards the door. You can't prove anything. He was in such shock that he didn't even hear approaching sirens. As soon as they went out the door, he was immediately seized by the police. A month later, Jodi and Dr. Bachman came to visit Mrs. Hambley. Just don't cook anything, the girl warned the hostess. Dr. Bachman and I will bring everything. Of course, the elderly woman did not listen to them, and 2 ruddy pies were waiting for hungry medical workers, one with chicken and the second with cherries. Oh, Mrs. Hambley, Dr. Bachman drawled in frustration. We've asked you not to fuss. Dr. Bachman, you asked me to move more, so I try not to sit still, the former patient replied cunningly. They sat down to drink tea, and Mrs. Hambley did not ask anything, until the doctor and the doctor-to-be had eaten. "What news do you have?" Jodi asked. "Yes, so far everything is the same," Mrs. Hambley replied. "Bill is being interrogated. The investigator said that the episodes about me and the chief doctor can be considered proven. But now they're spinning a whole network through him. There are such schemes. He says that he has been suspected for a long time, but still not been caught. And now you guys have brought him out into the open." "Do not diminish your merits," Dr. Bachman said. "How did you play the dying woman? It was gorgeous." Mrs. Hambley modestly shrugged her shoulders. "Well, I am an ex-actress after all. OK, what news do you have?" "Our chief doctor has been arrested," Dr. Bachman said. "I think there is no need to explain the reason. And most likely, as with your son-in-law, there will also be a whole network of crimes." "Wow," Mrs. Hambley exclaimed. "Has the new chief physician been appointed yet?" "No," Dr. Bachman shook his head and said. "So far, only the acting one. Most likely they will decide after the investigation is over." "Otherwise, what if he were also involved in this scheme?" Jodi explained cheerfully, taking another piece of cake. "This will be awkward." Mrs. Hambley suddenly laughed. "Well, we're a strange gang," she said cheerfully. "A half-dead granny, a doctor and a student." Dr. Beckman and Jodi laughed. "Mrs. Hambley, don't say that. You'll outlive us all yet," said the doctor. The elderly woman smiled. "Since you and Jodi appeared in my life, I really wanted to live." Jodi smiled and looked at Dr. Bachman. He gave her the same warm smile. "By the way, we brought champagne," Dr. Bachman suddenly said. "To celebrate such events. As a doctor, I give you a little permission today." So they sat until late in the evening. 3 people who just a few months ago were almost unrelated to each other have now become the closest people.